amazing would it be if we all had the excitement to give back to God the way little Noah does? In case you missed it, as soon as Jason started reading, he come running down the aisle with the check in the hand. Only to have Michelle run behind him and snatch him up and carry him back. Always interesting watching that. Anyway, here we are after a week off since we were out of town in week 10 of our Abraham series. We're in chapter 19. A lot goes down once again in chapter 19 where we're going to be today. And even though a lot goes down in chapter 18, we split it into two sections. Chapter 19, we're going to keep it to just 1 week. I think the main reason, though, that I'm doing that is because even though a lot of things happen in this chapter, it's a chapter that a lot of people are kind of familiar with from the beginning to the end. But what we're going to see today is really what happens when God has enough. When God's had enough. If you can remember from chapter 18, we did split it up into 2 different weeks. That first week we looked at the first half of the chapter about the invitation where God appeared to Abraham as in the appearance of 3 men. Then we saw the next week the appeal of God to Abraham, where Abraham did everything he could to try to spare the lives of the people living in Sodom. Chapter 18 ended with it saying God left Abraham, and then today we're going to see those other the 2 angels went on down to Sodom. Today has some interesting stories in it. We're going to stick with the verses 1 through 29, so it's a lot to cover. We're not going to be going in depth into a lot of these things, but we're going to be telling the story, hitting on some verses as we go through. So, with that being said, we are looking at what happens when God has had enough. And I think we should start off by asking ourselves this question. What happens when we've had enough? What do we do? How do we sometimes treat people around us when we've had enough? Whether it's we've had enough with that person or we've had enough with just life in general, everything going on around us. How do we treat people during those times? It can be different for a lot of people. Over the course of my life, I've treated that situation in different ways at times, I'm sure. As I get older, I've learned to have a little more patience. Terry can tell you I haven't learned to master patience, but I've learned to have a little more patience. And hopefully more and more as I get older. Maybe in the past I might have thrown things. Maybe hit a wall growing up or something else. Probably a lot of things, I did, maybe some of you, where you do it when something happens and you know immediately that you shouldn't have done it and you regret it. Been on the golf course with some people who, playing with me, who one club was tossed into a lake. Another club was smashed over their thigh. Neither one of them were me. Somebody else broke their club over their leg. The worst I did was just throw it about 15 feet. So you have situations like that. Now for the last week, we had a great vacation this past week. But we got home and we got tested rather quickly. For one, the garage door would not open. And we had already heard about that the garage door wouldn't open, so we kind of expected that, but we couldn't understand why. Then the front door wouldn't open, and that was no surprise to us because we've been having some issues with the door handle all along. And I finally fixed that. Well, it just started this a few days ago. I finally fixed it Friday after Terry's surprise that I fixed it. She was calling people to have them come fix it, and I went ahead and took it in my own hands and fixed it, just put a new handle on it. So then we go to the back door. We try the back door. Now, if you're like me, I don't have a lot of keys on my keychain, but half the keys on there, I don't have a clue what they even go to. But I figured I'd try those keys on there. One of them I was able to jam in there. It didn't get stuck or anything, but it wouldn't turn to the right or the left. So we called a locksmith to come over, and we start talking to him. He's like, well, let me just see that key. So he takes it, he turns it in there, and he jiggles it, and opens the door. So we got to pay $40 for a locksmith to teach us how to turn a key when it was kind of tight. So we had that. But of course, that's only the trouble, the beginning of the troubles. We get inside, the air conditioning's not working. It's not working downstairs, but it is working upstairs. We have 2 different units there. So we've got that going on. We walk into the garage then. We're going to try to open up the garage door from the inside. We've tried manually, wouldn't work. Tried the wall, wouldn't work. That's not it. Then we realized the refrigerator in the garage and the chest freezer are off. So we open up the refrigerator, we lost all the meat and every bit of food in that refrigerator and freezer. We go to the chest freezer, every bit of meat in there is unthawed. So we lost a lot of meat. We're talking like 10 racks of ribs, some Boston butts, some chicken, some steaks, some pork chops, shrimp, all the good stuff that you want, just when it's about to start cooling down and you can start grilling again comfortably. Good times, right? Well, then we noticed that about half the lights in the house work, half of them don't. So I go to the breaker box, and eight of them had tripped. 5 of them were able to reset, 3 of them, there was no hope. So we had to call an electrician to come in and have that taken care of. After that, we realized we had no internet. No big deal. I grew up half my life with no internet, but we've gotten used to it, so it ain't good. I mean, we just keep finding things. Every single day we keep finding something else. More and more, we'll find something else, I'm sure, wrong when we go home today. But the best part was we got home from that trip, we noticed all this stuff, we go to the Dash game, we took a bunch of people from Terry's work and some of the youth group here and some people from church there to the game, come home and we're tired, we're exhausted, get into bed, pull the covers up, finally get comfortable, because we're sleeping upstairs now, because that's the only place with air conditioning. Finally get comfortable, pull the covers up, the slats slip, the head, the mattress falls. So our feet are up in the air, our head are laying backwards. Now all you can do at first is just sit there. What else is going to go wrong? It's at this point we'd had enough of that day. So we go to another bedroom. That one didn't fall, so we finally got to sleep. Needless to say, we had enough. And apparently it all boils down to a lightning strike somewhere. So we're going to have an electrician come back and get some things done and see how much more money we get to spend on this. Sometimes we go through things like that and we just feel like we've had enough, don't we? We can't take any more. Well, today we're going to see in this story what happens when God had enough, really, with the city of Sodom, with the people and the lives they were living. They were known for more than just what the Christians talk about and what people preach about. We typically preach about the homosexual acts there within that city. And while, yes, that was certainly what we'll see today and a major part of what was going on, there was more to Sodom than just that, than just what we read about in Genesis chapter 19 and the dramatic stories there. Even a lot of people who don't attend church, they know somehow the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And God destroying the city, the escape of the city by Lot and his family, of Lot, his wife, looking back and turning into the pillar of salt. A lot of people who are not in church have even heard this story. And for years, there were many skeptics, and probably still today, skeptics, though, that when it came to this story in the Bible, they just couldn't believe that it happened. But they have found, they say, at the southern end of the Dead Sea, ruins of ancient cities. And the cities appear to, they say, to have been suddenly destroyed by fire, which matches and fits the description of Genesis chapter 19. So, let's get into this story today. And some people will say that today's story, even though it's an Abraham series, isn't about Abraham. It's more about Lot. And yes, that's the case. It's about his nephew Lot. But it also kind of completes the story from Acts chapter 18 that we looked at over the last couple of Sundays that we were here. After Abraham had pleaded with God to spare Sodom, we see then what happens today. And what we see first in chapter 19 is this. Lot had arrived. And I don't mean that he had arrived physically in person to the city of Sodom. I mean he had moved up the ladder in life in Sodom. He was now in a position of importance in the city of Sodom. This is what we read in verse 1. The 2 angels came to Sodom at evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed himself with his face to the earth. It's something most people don't think about. But we see here in this verse the importance of Lot now in the city of Sodom. The chapter opens up with Lot sitting at the gate of Sodom, the entrance to the city. To us, doesn't mean much if you don't really study or look into it. But to the people of that day, it meant Lot had arrived. And although he was the nephew of Abraham, and had lived in some rural areas at time during life, he had now moved to the big city, and he was doing well. The gate, that's where the elders, the rulers, the leaders of those cities would sit. They would go there and meet. People would come up to them to have cases decided, to make decisions for them. And so Lot is now in that class when it came to importance in Sodom. So here is Lot. You could say he's a man of God, becoming a leader in a city that was known for having all types of sin and wickedness in it. When you really think about it, Lot probably could have had a big say in certain matters during in that time of day. When you look at what we know of him from the stories in Genesis, we see more of a downward spiral in the life of Lot as we first meet him. When we first meet him, he's with Abraham. Well, then he looks at Sodom. Then he decides to move near Sodom. But that wasn't enough. He then had to move and live inside of Sodom. That wasn't enough. He then had to become a person who was like a leader in this wicked city. Now, I truly believe that in life, Lot meant well. Maybe he just got caught up in stuff. I don't know. I don't think he ever had any intention of putting his family in harm's way. I don't think he started living in Sodom like the way the people of Sodom were living. Maybe he thought he could make a difference there. I don't know. Whatever the reasons were for Lot choosing Sodom, I don't know. But now he's up to his neck. He's deeply involved in Sodom. And things begin to change in a hurry when we see Lot and the angels. Those two angels that had appeared and had been with Abraham now had appeared in Sodom in the evening. And if you remember from Abraham, chapter 18, and during those days, it was typical that when someone showed up to your house, you went out and greeted them well. People typically bowed down to them, invited them in, prepared stuff for them, welcomed them, provided for them. Well, Lot here is a gracious man as well. And because it was the custom of the day, Lot invites these two men, which are angels, into his home to spend the night with him. Mainly because he knew what his city was like, and he wanted to get them away from everything else. Probably just didn't want to even know and see all this stuff. And just like when they first appeared to Abraham, we looked at 3 weeks ago, and Abraham didn't know that they were not just ordinary men at first, apparently. The same here with Lot. This was simply an act of hospitality here by Lot. And it wasn't normal for the people living in the city of Sodom to be this hospitable. And so after these two men arrive, word begins to spread around the city that these two men are here, that they're staying in Lot's house. And when these men hear of it, we begin to see really the type of character of the people who are living in the city of Sodom. Verses 4 and 5 give us a picture of what it was like to live there. Those verses say this: "But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house. And they called to Lot, 'Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we may know them.'" Now this is the English Standard Version. It says that we may know them. Let me assure you, as you already know, they weren't just wanting to talk and introduce themselves and meet them. Other versions say, "Bring them out to us so that we may have relations with them." Other versions might even be a little bit more graphic than that. But I think you get the point here. These men in the city of Sodom, they were homosexuals who wanted to basically rape these two men. Sounds awful, but it's what it was. And so, from this story right here, and from what happens here, we get the word sodomy today. When you read through the Bible, it's hard to really find a more perverse, wicked, evil act than what these people were trying to do right here in chapter 19. And just think about what it says there. It wasn't one man, it wasn't two or just a handful of people. All the men in that city, it says, surrounded that house. But what Lot does then, seems to me, is just as despicable. Lot doesn't give the two men over. What does he do? We're not going to read it. But instead, Lot decides he offers up his two virgin daughters. so they can do whatever they want to with them instead of these men. Now, I can't imagine a parent doing that, or a grandparent, or any type of guardian doing that. But these men weren't interested in his daughters. They kept wanting these two men. They continued to demand that he give them over so that they can do with him what they please. But God still chooses to give Lot a way out here. Once again, I think we see the mercy of God in this series. We've seen it in this series of Abraham so far. We see the mercy of God here with Lot, the God that we love and serve. God could have just said, Lot brought it upon himself. He can deal with it. He can die. He's the one who chose to go there. But this is what verses 10 and 11 say. But the men reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck with blindness the men who were at the entrance of the door, both small and great, so that they wore themselves out groping for the door. I know there's a typo, Amy, so don't say anything. It's a horrific scene, right? Think about how terrible it is when we're watching the news in our day and time and we have riots or whatever in cities. And people are surrounding stuff. They're breaking down windows. They're throwing stuff through them. They're knocking down doors. They're burning things down. They're stealing. Well, these people are all surrounding the house of Lot. They're trying to get in. They're probably banging on the walls, the doors, all this stuff. No doubt, it was scary to be in that situation. And I think it was maybe at this point where Lot might begin to finally realize that these were not two ordinary men. They had just struck all these men with blindness. Maybe he began to realize finally that these men were sent by God, here to destroy the city. But before the city is destroyed, they first give Lot and his family a chance to escape. That's how merciful our God is. He doesn't give us what we deserve sometimes, and that's a good thing. And we should be thankful for that. And so when Lot tells his sons-in-law that, hey, this city is going to be destroyed, God's going to destroy it, you need to get ready to get out of here, what do? They laugh at him. The Bible says they thought he was jesting, they thought he was joking. But come morning, and this is what we read in the 15th verse. As morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, Up, take your wife and your two daughters who are here, lest you be swept away in the punishment of the city. It was one final message, one final attempt from the angels. That they either follow the advice or they could be swept away, killed with the rest of the city. Now remember, God had already shown his mercy at the end of chapter 18 during that appeal. He had already shown his mercy in saying that, and agreeing with Abraham, as Abraham talked him down, that if just 10 people were found that were righteous in the city, that he would spare the entire city. Just 10. So we're seeing just how evil this city really is. Just how wicked the city of Sodom was. Now, after these men were struck with blindness the night before, don't you think maybe Lot would have said, I think I'm going to listen to what they have to say. If they tell me to get up and go, I'm just going to leave. But the first three words of the next verse said, but he lingered. Some versions will say, but he hesitated. Now it appears here that Lot had fallen in love with the city of Sodom. He didn't want to leave it, even after what had just happened. It appears maybe that Lot was giving in or just accepting everything that was going on. We know he had made a lot of friends there. He must have made a lot of friends to be put in a position where he sat at the gate entering the city. Maybe he didn't live that lifestyle that the men of that city were living in this chapter. But he obviously loved being in the city enough to hesitate, to not just take off running like you would assume he would. In biblical terms, you would say that Lot loved the world more than he loved God at this moment. And remember these words from 1 John 2:15. Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh and the desires of the eyes and the pride of life is not from the Father, but is from the world. You know, these are words, to be honest with you, that I think many people in our world would rather not hear. But obviously it's nothing new. It's not new to our world. We're not the first people who love the world more than we love God as a society. It's obviously nothing new. People were writing about this as well in the New Testament. James wrote about it, others. But we also see it way back in Genesis 19. The love of the world has been going on for years, thousands of years. It's not just our day and time. We know we live in a time where we have a lot of evil and wickedness around us. There are a lot of great things as well. But we do live in a world that has sin in it. But God's love is real. God's love is pure. But the love that we're talking about here in this verse is that John is giving us is a warning about loving things for all the wrong reasons. I'm sure most of us have heard that we should be in the world, but not of the world. D.L. Moody said it this way, very simple. When the boat is in the water, that's good. When the water's in the boat, that's bad. Can't get much more simple than that. Now, we see Lot here because he's hesitating, because he's been there for so long. He would rather be a part of Sodom. He'd rather be a part of this world, just living in whatever's going on, doing what the world does instead of doing what God says. Lot could see the water in the boat. He could see what all was going on, but he still wanted to take his chances. So think about that. He loved Sodom so much that he was almost willing to risk his own life and his family lives to be destroyed because he enjoyed it so much there. That's how much he loved it. He loved it so much that even when they tell him to get far away, he begs to be able to stay. Can't I just stay at a nearby place? He still wanted to stay close. He didn't want to get too far away from the city. And that's really what got Lot in trouble in the first place, when he separated from Adam. He saw Sodom. He had to get close to it, and then he lived in it. That's the way it works with us in sin. We see things going on. We fiddle around with it a little bit, and then before you know it, you're caught. You're stuck in it. Lot and his time with the angels. It's a very interesting story. But why would God destroy Sodom? For many people, the simple answer is to say that God destroyed Sodom because of the sin of homosexuality. And yes, that was certainly a big part of it. But that wasn't it. Listen to these words from Ezekiel 16, verses 49 through 50. Behold, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy. They were haughty and did an abomination before me, so I removed them when I saw them. We all know what happened in Genesis chapter 19. I just told that story. We get caught up in that story, as that's the only reason sometimes that we want to point out that the city of Sodom was destroyed. But Sodom was known for many sins they were involved in. They were wicked in all sorts of different ways. The greatest of them, as it's talking about here, might have been pride. Maybe you're familiar with these words from Proverbs 16:18. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. See, Sodom's a prime example, really, of how far we can fall when pride sets in. Because when pride sets in, we begin to be overly confident in what we have done and what we can do ourselves. That's really what's going on in the city of Sodom. They were a prideful people. And then Solomon goes on to talk about how they had all this food. Or not Solomon, but in Ezekiel, we talk about how they had all this food. Talks about how they were prosperous, how they were wealthy. They had all these possessions and money, but they did nothing for the poor or those who were in need. Sure, they had sexual sins. God made that clear in the Bible. He made it clear how He feels about that. But they had an overdose of pride. And I think here's what we have to understand about any sin. The outward sin, what we see, what we hear taking place, reflects our inward desire. It all starts with the heart. And it's really about whether we want to love God wholly with our hearts and do what God wants us to do, or do we love ourselves or the world more, and then do what we want to do instead. So what can we learn from this here? I think you can learn a lot from the events in Genesis chapter 19. We can be appalled at some of this. Some people are appalled at the actions of the men. Some people are appalled that God would destroy an entire city. But I think we need to learn and understand a few things here real quick. God's hurt. He is hurt by moral perversion. And in the case of Sodom, some would point out that, hey, this happened a long time ago. There was a different culture, a different era, a different world. But then, a couple thousand years later, in Romans chapter 1, Paul writes about it again, how it was still an abomination for God. And we have to remember that God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So the time period for when something happens or when something was a sin doesn't make any difference. If it was wrong then, wrong is always wrong and right is always right. But we also see here that God gives warnings. He gives warnings to the ungodly and He gives warning to the righteous. Our God is a God of love. He certainly is. But God is also a God that has to judge. And He has to judge fairly. And once again, we have to notice here that God not only gives us warnings, but He gives us mercy when we don't deserve it. And what you can see here is perhaps God was giving mercy on the surrounding cities, the people that lived around there. By destroying these cities, it certainly kept that lifestyle from spreading out any further. I don't know. But above all, I see God's mercy here with Lot and his family. Lot was living there. He was accepting all sorts of things. It was just part of who he was. He may not have taken part in things, but he was right there with it. And God chose to just give him another chance. He chose to give him a way out. And we also see here that righteous people failed to act in this situation. Now, as righteous people, as godly people, we're supposed to be the salt of the earth. So here in Sodom, if there was anyone who was righteous, you could say that that salt had lost its flavor. As righteous people, as God's children, we're to act and call on what God and do what God calls us to do. So as we finish up, I think there's several things we can learn in this chapter. But among, I think, the top is staying close to God and preventing pride from setting in. Because when pride sets in, we begin to do things for ourselves to get what we want. That's really the sole heart of the issue for the people living in Sodom. Yes, they were living in different types of sin, but it was because they had their pride and they wanted to live life their own way. And in doing so, pride set in. And so I pray here that we here at Double Creek never let pride take over our lives. Because once that happens, we become people who are unwilling to listen to truth. That's what happened to the people of Sodom. And it can happen easily to anyone in our world as well. There comes a point in time where God has had enough. It happened in the days of Noah. It happened in Sodom. And we live in a world full of prideful people. God was giving them a way out. If just 10 righteous people, that's not many. If just 10 righteous people had been found in the entire city, He would spare them. He was giving them a way out. And God has given us a way out today through His Son, Jesus Christ. And it's always interesting to see and exciting to see someone give their life to Jesus Christ, to be immersed. And in the last couple of weeks, we've been able to experience that a couple of times. And it's exciting times. It's times where you're full of joy. The Bible tells us the angels rejoice in heaven over one sinner who repents. God's given us a way out of this world that we live in. A world that we know is evil, a world that we can easily get sucked into. He's given us the way out if we would just follow His word. If you've never given your life to Jesus Christ and put your faith in Jesus, if you've never confessed Him before God, if you've never been willing to repent, to be immersed in the waters of baptism, have your sins washed away, to live a faithful life, you have the opportunity to always do that. Reach out to us and let's make that happen. We're going to stand and sing a hymn of invitation here this morning. We'll sing song number 209, the nail scarred hand, first and last verses.